I stood in my custom silk wedding gown staring at the heavy steel chains locking the glass doors of the grand atrium. The venue was pitch black inside. My fiancé was standing right next to me, mindlessly scrolling through his phone as if we were waiting for a train. A moment later, his mother stepped out of a luxury vehicle, looked me up and down with absolute disgust, and proudly announced that she had canceled my entire wedding. She told me a girl from the South Atlanta slums did not deserve to step into her family banquet hall. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just checked my watch. Thought about the $150,000 I had personally wired her property management company, and made a single phone call that would dismantle her entire fraudulent empire by midnight. Before I continue the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic family a lesson they will never forget. My name is Zariah, and I am 30 years old. The warm afternoon wind whipped the heavy silk hem of my gown around my ankles as I stood on the polished concrete of the parking lot. It was 3 o'clock on a Saturday. In exactly 1 hour, 600 guests were scheduled to walk through those doors to celebrate what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. But there were no doors to walk through. A thick rust-proof steel chain was wrapped securely around the golden handles of the main entrance, locked tight with a heavy industrial padlock. The massive ballroom inside, which should have been glowing with crystal chandeliers and filled with the scent of fresh white roses, was completely dark and entirely empty. I turned my head to look at Marcus. This was the man I had spent the last 4 years loving. The man I was building a life with, and the man I was supposed to marry in less than 60 minutes. He was standing just 3 feet away from me, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that I had paid for out of my own pocket. He was not looking at the locked doors. He was not looking at me. He was staring down at his phone screen, his thumb swiping casually. He looked completely unbothered by the fact that our massive wedding celebration was currently locked behind an iron chain. The silence between us was suffocating. I opened my mouth to ask him what was going on, but before I could even speak, the low, aggressive rumble of a massive engine broke the quiet. A black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the VIP drop-off lane, its tires screeching slightly against the pavement. The back door swung open before the vehicle even came to a complete stop. Out stepped Vivian, my soon-to-be mother-in-law. She was wearing a deep emerald green gown that looked entirely too bridal for the occasion. Her neck was dripping with diamond jewelry that I knew for a fact her husband had heavily mortgaged just to keep up appearances. Vivian did not rush over to comfort me. She did not look confused by the chains on the door. She walked up the concrete steps with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who believed they owned the world. She stopped 2 steps below me, pulled her designer sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, and looked me up and down with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "I canceled this place," she announced, her voice echoing sharply against the empty glass facade of the building. "A girl from the South Atlanta slums does not deserve to step into our family banquet hall." Most brides would have collapsed right there on the concrete. Most women would have dropped to their knees, ruined their expensive makeup with tears, and begged for an explanation. But I am not most women. I grew up fighting for everything I have. I built my own crisis management firm from the ground up, and I learned exactly how to read my enemies. I did not let a single emotion cross my face. I simply looked at Vivian, taking in her smug smile and the way she held her chin high, fully expecting me to break down in front of her. I slowly raised my left wrist and checked the time on my watch. It was a solid gold piece I had bought for myself to celebrate closing my first major corporate contract. I looked back at her and kept my voice completely level, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me sweat. "You canceled the venue that I personally paid for," I said, making sure my words were clear and precise. "I transferred $150,000 to your property management company on Tuesday to finalize the premium catering, the floral arrangements, and the security for this exact building. Are you telling me that my money is gone?" Vivian waved her manicured hand in the air as if she were swatting away an annoying fly. "Oh, please, Zariah," she scoffed loudly. That money went to family expenses. We had much more important things to take care of than feeding your side of the family. You should be grateful we even considered letting you use the grand atrium in the first place. But after thinking it over, I realized it would be an absolute tragedy to let someone of your background taint our family image in front of Atlanta high society. You can go have a cheap backyard barbecue somewhere else. My blood ran cold, but my mind was operating at lightning speed. She had just openly admitted to embezzling my wedding funds. I shifted my gaze to Marcus. Surely the man who claimed to love me, the man who promised to protect me, would step up. He was still holding his phone. He finally looked up, his eyes actively avoiding mine. He shifted his weight nervously, glancing between his arrogant mother and the heavy chains on the glass doors. "Marcus," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "your mother just admitted to stealing $150,000 from my business account and locking us out of our own wedding. What exactly are you going to do about this?" Marcus shoved his free hand into his tuxedo pocket and let out a heavy, irritated sigh. He looked at me, not with apology, not with righteous anger on my behalf, but with pure annoyance. "Zariah, just let it go," he mumbled, refusing to make eye contact. "You are embarrassing yourself by raising your voice. The family needed the cash for a corporate emergency. Just cancel the wedding and send everyone home. We can go to the courthouse on Monday morning if you really want to get married. Do not make a huge deal out of this." I stared at the man I thought was my partner. In that one split second, every illusion I had about him shattered into a million pieces. He was not a man. He was a coward hiding behind his mother designer skirt, fully willing to let me be publicly humiliated and financially robbed just to keep the peace in his toxic household. The love I had for him evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The sound of tires rolling over gravel caught my attention. I looked past Vivian and Marcus toward the main entrance of the property. The massive iron gates of the parking lot were opening wide. Cars were starting to pour in. First, a silver luxury sedan, then a line of black sport utility vehicles, then a parade of cars stretching all the way down the main street. 600 guests were arriving. My family from the South Side, who had saved up for months to buy new suits and dresses for this occasion. His wealthy relatives, the local politicians, the socialites, all arriving to witness the grand union of two prominent families. Vivian smirked, turning her head to watch the endless stream of cars pulling into the lot. "Let us see how the big shot executive explains this massive failure to everyone," she whispered maliciously, her eyes gleaming with wicked satisfaction. "I am sure your little side of the family will be completely used to this kind of disappointment." I did not argue with her. I did not shout or curse. I reached into the hidden pocket of my custom gown and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed a specific number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a deep professional voice answered on the other end. "Yes, Director," the voice said immediately. I kept my eyes locked on Vivian's smug, arrogant face as I spoke into the receiver. My tone was pure ice. "Initiate Protocol 4, I commanded. Bring the broadcast vans, bring the legal team, and bring the outdoor projectors. We are going live in exactly 20 minutes. I hung up the phone and slipped it calmly back into my dress pocket. Vivian's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She had absolutely no idea that the call I just made was not to save our wedding. It was to execute the complete and total destruction of her entire fraudulent empire live on television for all of Atlanta to see. The heavy iron gates of the Grand Atrium parking lot groaned as they locked into their fully open position, letting in a massive flood of luxury sedans and pristine sports cars. Hundreds of guests were stepping out into the warm afternoon air, dressed in their absolute best, expecting to be ushered into a grand celebration. Instead, they were met with a locked building and a tense standoff on the concrete steps. Vivian saw the audience arriving, and her entire demeanor shifted in the blink of an eye. The cold, arrogant sneer vanished from her face, replaced instantly by a trembling lower lip and wide, tear-filled eyes. She reached up and dramatically clutched the heavy diamond necklace resting on her chest, as if she were suddenly struggling to breathe. She was a master manipulator, and this parking lot was her stage. "Oh, my poor Marcus!" she wailed, her voice carrying perfectly over the sound of slamming car doors and confused chatter. She stumbled down the concrete steps, practically throwing herself into the arms of Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Charles, who had just stepped out of a silver Mercedes. Aunt Beatrice, a woman who wore her wealth like a weapon draped in pearls and smelling of expensive perfume, immediately wrapped her arms around Vivian and asked what on earth was going on. Vivian let out a loud theatrical sob that echoed across the pavement, drawing the attention of every single guest within earshot. "She lied to us, Beatrice," Vivian cried out, making sure her voice was loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "She lied to our sweet boy. Her entire business is a total sham, and she is completely bankrupt." A collective gasp rippled through the wealthy side of the family. Dozens of Marcus relatives stopped in their tracks, their eyes darting between Vivian's sobbing form and my completely silent stance. Vivian wiped away a fake tear and continued spinning her web of absolute garbage. She claimed that my crisis management firm was millions of dollars in debt and that I had bounced every single check for the venue. She told them that the management locked the doors because I was a fraud who could not even afford the basic floral arrangements. She then placed a hand on Marcus' shoulder, pulling him close as if he were a wounded animal. She told the crowd that I was rushing this wedding because I desperately needed to trap him into marriage so his family wealth could cover my massive corporate failures. I stood perfectly still, simply watching her perform. In my line of work, handling high-profile political scandals and corporate meltdowns, I learned that letting the opposition speak is the best way to gather ammunition. Every lie Vivian told was just another nail in her own coffin. It was honestly impressive how quickly she could invent such a detailed and vicious narrative. Uncle Charles shook his head in absolute disgust, his face turning red with indignation. He pointed a thick finger in my direction and loudly declared that he always knew there was something wrong with me. He told the crowd that girls from South Atlanta only know how to hustle and scam their way to the top. The whispers started immediately spreading through the crowd of wealthy socialites like wildfire. Women in designer dresses covered their mouths as they threw nasty glares in my direction. Men in expensive suits scoffed and shook their heads, whispering about how Marcus had dodged a massive financial bullet. Some of his younger cousins even pulled out their cell phones, pointing their cameras at me to record what they thought was my ultimate humiliation. They called me a gold digger, a scam artist, and a desperate woman trying to steal their family legacy. Marcus just stood there letting his mother assassinate my character in front of hundreds of people. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes, looking like a tragic victim rather than the coward he truly was. He did not say a single word to defend me. He did not tell them that I was the one who paid for his tuxedo or that my business was wildly successful. He just let them tear me apart because it was easier than standing up to his mother. Then the second wave of cars began to park. These were not luxury sedans or expensive sports utility vehicles. These were sensible sedans, pickup trucks, and a rented passenger van. My family had arrived. My father stepped out of his 10-year-old car wearing a suit he had meticulously dry cleaned for this exact day. He looked so proud, so incredibly happy to see his daughter get married. My mother stepped out next, wearing a simple, modest dress she had saved up for months to buy. My cousins, aunts, and uncles began piling out of their vehicles, laughing and holding beautifully wrapped gifts. They stopped when they noticed the massive crowd of wealthy relatives staring at them with pure, unadulterated hostility. The clash of classes was immediate and physically painful to watch. Vivian's side of the family looked at my relatives like they were a disease that had just infected their pristine environment. I could hear Aunt Beatrice's loud whisper cutting through the tense air. She told the women around her to look at those cheap clothes and said my family probably only showed up to get a free meal and steal the silverware. Another cousin of Marcus laughed and pointed at my father's worn-out dress shoes, saying it looked like we had bought our entire wardrobe from a discount thrift store. My father looked confused seeing the locked doors and the glaring crowd. He started walking toward me, his face full of concern. My mother followed close behind, clutching her purse tightly against her chest as she noticed the nasty whispers and the pointed fingers. I held up my hand, signaling for them to stay back. I did not want them anywhere near Vivian toxic venom. I gave my father a reassuring nod, a silent promise that I had everything under control. He stopped trusting me completely, even though he had no idea what was happening. Vivian noticed my family arriving and she cranked her performance up to another level. She leaned heavily against Marcus, crying about how my family was probably in on the scam. She told her wealthy friends that we were nothing but a bunch of working-class opportunists trying to leech off their hard-earned success. The parking lot physically divided itself. On one side stood the elite, arrogant family I was supposed to marry into sneering and throwing shade. On the other side stood my honest, hard-working family, confused but standing tall with quiet dignity. I looked at the vast sea of judging faces and felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. They were digging their own graves with every nasty whisper and every false accusation. They thought they were humiliating a helpless, broke girl from the South Side. They had no idea they were publicly insulting the sole owner of the very ground they were standing on. I just needed to buy a few more minutes for my team to arrive. The hostility in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife, but I refused to break character. I simply crossed my arms over my silk gown and waited for the next layer of their delusion to unfold. Just as the silence stretched into a heavy, uncomfortable pause, the sharp roar of a high-performance engine shattered the tension. A pristine white Porsche Panamera aggressively pulled into the VIP drop-off lane, parking illegally across two spaces, right next to Vivian luxury vehicle. The doors swung open and the crowd of wealthy relatives visibly relaxed, parting like the Red Sea, to make way for the golden couple of the family. It was Julian Marcus' younger brother and his wife, Chloe. Julian stepped out first, wearing a custom-tailored navy suit, adjusting his expensive platinum watch with an air of complete arrogance. He had always lived in Marcus' shadow, but he found his ultimate weapon in his wife. All eyes immediately shifted to the passenger side as Chloe made her grand entrance. She stepped out of the low sports car, her designer heels clicking loudly and sharply against the concrete. She was a tall, slender white woman who carried herself with a deeply ingrained sense of superiority. I watched from the bottom of the steps as she stood on the elevated curb looking down at me. The visual hierarchy was deliberately orchestrated and not lost on anyone present. She positioned herself physically higher on the pavement, tilting her chin down to look at me through her perfectly manicured eyelashes, creating a deeply condescending vibe. In one hand, she held a massive iced coffee cup from an expensive boutique cafe, the condensation dripping onto her heavily ringed fingers. But what truly solidified her absolute disrespect was her outfit. She was wearing a form-fitting floor-length white lace dress. She had intentionally shown up to her future sister-in-law wedding wearing a white bridal-style gown. Chloe did not immediately address me. She took her sweet time acting as if she were inspecting a damaged piece of merchandise on a discount store shelf. She slowly walked over to Vivian, who immediately threw her arms around Chloe, shoulder-sobbing a fresh batch of fake tears. "Oh, Chloe," Vivian wailed, burying her face in the white lace of Chloe's dress. "It is a complete disaster. She is completely broke and trying to ruin our family name. We are the victims here." Chloe patted Vivian back with her free hand, offering a sympathetic pout that looked entirely rehearsed in a mirror. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her iced coffee, the plastic straw making a hollow sound, before finally turning her gaze back to me. Her pale blue eyes swept over my custom silk gown, then shifted to look at my family standing silently behind me. I could see the exact moment her upper lip curled into a sneer of pure, unadulterated disdain. "Zaria," she sighed loudly, shaking her blonde head slowly with mock pity. "I cannot say I am entirely surprised by any of this unfortunate mess. I told Vivian and Marcus from the very beginning that someone like you would simply not fit into our family culture. You just do not understand how things work in our world." The microaggression was so loud it practically echoed across the vast parking lot. Our world, our culture. She was not just talking about generational wealth. She was weaponizing her privilege, wrapping her underlying prejudice in a thin veil of corporate politeness. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinner where she loudly asked if my hair was real in front of 20 guests. I remembered the bridal shower where she gifted me a book on basic financial literacy as a joke. This was just the grand finale of her campaign against me. Julian stepped up beside her, wrapping a protective arm around her waist and nodding in vigorous agreement. He looked at his older brother Marcus, who was still staring pathetic and silent at the ground, and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "I told you, man," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You try to pull someone up from the south side out of the gutter, and this is exactly what happens. They drag you right back down to their level. You should have listened to Chloe. She has a degree in business. She knows how to spot a walking liability." Chloe smiled at her husband, a smug, self-satisfied expression plastered across her face. She took another step toward me, her heels clicking sharply, sounding like a judge banging a gavel. "You see, Zariah?" She continued, her voice adopting that sickly, sweet, condescending tone, usually reserved for scolding, misbehaving children. "We value financial responsibility in this family. We value transparency, class, and proper breeding. Coming here today expecting us to foot the bill for your massive professional failures while parading your relatives around our venue is just unacceptable. It is honestly incredibly aggressive of you to even stand there looking at us like we did something wrong." There it was, the word aggressive, the classic label designed to paint me as the angry, irrational black woman while she played the delicate, civilized victim. My mother, who was standing a few yards away, gasped quietly, her hands tightening fiercely around her worn leather purse. I could see my father tense up, his jaw clenching, ready to step forward and defend his daughter against this blatant public disrespect. I quickly held up one finger behind my back, signaling my family to stay exactly where they were. I did not need saving. I handled hostile actors for a living. I looked right back at Chloe, studying her pale face and her arrogant posture. She thought she held all the cards. She thought her proximity to the family wealth and her inherent privilege made her completely untouchable. She had spent the last 2 years pretending my highly successful public relations firm was just a cute little urban hobby. I let her talk. I let her dig the hole deeper and wider. Chloe took my silence as a sign of submission. She took another long sip of her iced coffee, the ice clinking loudly in the quiet parking lot. "You really should have known your place, Zariah," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a softer, more lethal volume intended only for those standing closest to hear. "You thought you could hustle your way into our legacy. Look at your family standing over there looking completely lost in their cheap suits. They do not belong here, and neither do you. You should do everyone a huge favor and just leave before you make an even bigger scene. We do not want to have to call the police to escort you off the premises." The wealthy relatives nodded in furious agreement, murmuring their loud approval of Chloe's harsh words. They saw her as their ultimate protector, their elegant spokesperson, putting the desperate scam artist back in her proper place. Aunt Beatrice loudly proclaimed that Chloe was entirely right and that the authorities should be called immediately to deal with the trespassers. I maintained my perfectly neutral expression, drawing on years of professional media training. I did not raise my voice. I did not ball my hands into fists. I simply let the silence stretch for 10 agonizing seconds, forcing Chloe to endure the heavy, crushing weight of my unbroken eye contact. Her smug smile began to falter just a fraction under my intense, unblinking stare. She shifted her weight uncomfortably, adjusting her grip on her iced coffee cup as the silence grew unbearable. "You talk a great deal about financial responsibility, Chloe," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. It carried perfectly through the tense air, reaching every single person in the crowd. "You talk about transparency and class and protecting the family legacy from liabilities." Chloe lifted her chin defensively, her eyes narrowing. "I speak the truth," she snapped back, her sweet tone cracking slightly to reveal the venom underneath. "Something you clearly know absolutely nothing about." I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The distance between us closed just enough for her to feel the undeniable shift in power. I did not blink as I delivered my next sentence, locking eyes with her. "I do find it absolutely fascinating, Chloe," I said, projecting my voice clearly over the murmurs of the crowd, "that you want to stand here and preach about transparency and financial responsibility, especially considering your own business history. I have never seen a walking liability critique someone else's balance sheet before." Chloe scoffed, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. I run a highly successful lifestyle brand, she shot back, her voice dripping with indignation. My company has been featured in 3 major regional magazines just this year. You run a glorified babysitting service for politicians who cannot keep their mouths shut on social media. We are not the same, Zariah. Do not ever pretend that we are on the same level. We certainly are not on the same level, I agreed, nodding slowly as if acknowledging a deeply profound truth. For one, I actually pay my taxes. The silence that followed was absolute. The kind of dead quiet that only happens when someone drops a bomb so large no one knows how to react to the shockwave. Chloe's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of genuine panic that made her grip on her iced coffee tighten so hard the plastic cup buckled slightly. Julian stepped forward, pointing a finger aggressively in my face. "Watch your mouth, Zariah!" he barked, his face turning an angry shade of red. "You do not get to stand here and slander my wife just because your own life is falling apart. You are just jealous because she actually comes from money and knows how to build real generational wealth." "I am not slandering anyone, Julian," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly even and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. Slander requires the statement to be false. I am simply stating a well-documented fact. Your wife lifestyle brand has not turned a single dollar of profit in 36 months. She has defaulted on 2 commercial leases in the downtown district, and she currently owes the Internal Revenue Service over $300,000 in back taxes and penalties. Her company is not a business, Julian. It is a wildly expensive vanity project funded entirely by a mountain of high-interest debt that she has been desperately trying to hide from the federal government. The crowd of wealthy relatives gasped audibly. Aunt Beatrice clutched her pearls, staring at Chloe with wide, disbelieving eyes. Uncle Charles frowned heavily, turning his gaze toward Julian, demanding a silent explanation. The immaculate facade Chloe had spent years building was cracking right down the middle in front of the very people she worked so hard to impress. Chloe's reaction was immediate and entirely calculated. She knew she could not argue the facts because they were absolutely true. So she did the only thing she could do to survive the moment. She played her ultimate trump card. She weaponized my race and my gender. She took 3 rapid steps backward, physically retreating from me as if I had suddenly drawn a weapon. Her breathing became shallow and erratic, and she pressed a hand against her chest, looking around at the crowd with wide, terrified eyes. She let out a small, frightened gasp that carried perfectly across the concrete parking lot. "Why are you being so aggressive, Zariah?" she cried out, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical precision. "You are screaming at me. You are attacking me for absolutely no reason. I am literally just standing here trying to help Vivian, and you are threatening me." I had not raised my voice. I had not moved a single muscle toward her. I had not made a single threatening gesture. But reality did not matter anymore. Chloe had invoked the powerful, deeply ingrained stereotype of the angry black woman, and the wealthy white crowd eagerly swallowed the narrative. They needed a villain to protect their fragile social ecosystem, and Chloe had just served me up on a silver platter. Vivian rushed forward immediately, wrapping her arms around her trembling daughter-in-law, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You see this, Marcus," Vivian yelled, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You see how she treats your family. This is exactly why I canceled the venue. She is completely out of control. She is violent and unstable, and I will not allow her to terrorize Chloe like this." Julian stepped between me and his wife, puffing out his chest and trying to look physically intimidating. "Back off, Zariah," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You need to calm down right now before I call security. You are acting completely unhinged. You cannot just stand here screaming and making up lies about white women just because you are bitter and broke." Aunt Beatrice stepped forward, flanked by 2 other wealthy older women, forming a protective physical barrier around the supposedly traumatized Chloe. "It is always the same with these people," Beatrice muttered, shaking her head in disgust. "The second things do not go their way, they get loud and aggressive. It is just their nature. You simply cannot civilize them." I looked at Marcus, my supposed protector, my future husband. He was staring at me with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He actually looked disgusted. "Zariah, just stop it," he hissed under his breath, stepping closer to his mother's side. "You are acting crazy." Just apologize to Chloe and leave. You are making a massive scene and proving my mother right. I stood there surrounded by a sea of hostile faces, realizing the absolute absurdity of the situation. I was the one who had been locked out of my own wedding. I was the one who had $150,000 stolen from my business account. I was the one being publicly humiliated and racially profiled. Yet somehow, in their twisted reality, I was the aggressor, and Chloe, the woman who had just hurled insults at my entire family, was the fragile victim needing protection from my terrifying presence. My family was watching all of this unfold from a distance. I saw my father take a step forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, unable to watch his daughter be subjected to this kind of blatant racism. My mother placed a restraining hand on his arm, whispering fiercely into his ear, keeping him anchored. They knew as well as I did that if my father, a tall black man, stepped into that circle of wealthy white relatives, the police would be called immediately, and the situation would escalate into something dangerous. I caught my father's eye and gave him a single sharp shake of my head. I had this under control. I turned my attention back to the protective wall of relatives surrounding Chloe. She was peeking out from behind Vivian, shoulder dabbing at imaginary tears with a tissue someone had handed her. She thought she had won. She thought her white tears had effectively silenced me and shifted the focus away from her massive financial fraud. She underestimated me entirely. I let the chaos swirl around me for a moment longer, absorbing their hatred, their thinly veiled racism, and their absolute arrogance. I needed them to feel completely secure in their victory. I needed them to believe that I was beaten and broken. Because the higher they built their pedestal of moral superiority, the harder the fall was going to be when I finally kicked it out from under them. I took a deep breath, centering myself, and let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked directly at Chloe, ignoring the angry demands for an apology coming from every direction. I did not need to raise my voice to cut through their noise. My silence had unnerved them, but my next words were going to destroy them completely. Chloe stood safely behind her wall of wealthy relatives, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. Seeing that I was not backing down or running away in tears, she decided to double down. She tilted her chin up, wiping away her fragile victim persona and replacing it with a look of overwhelming pity. She looked at Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Charles, making sure she had their full, undivided attention before she delivered what she thought would be the final nail in my coffin. "It makes sense that she is acting this unhinged," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sadness and practiced concern. "We really should not be surprised, Beatrice. She is just projecting her own financial ruin onto me because she is desperate and embarrassed. You all do not know this because we were trying to be respectful of her privacy, but Zariah actually came crying to Julian last month begging for a massive loan." The crowd gasped again, practically hanging on to every single word Chloe spoke. Julian immediately puffed out his chest, playing the role of the responsible, wealthy savior who had been put in a terrible position by a gold-digging future sister-in-law. He adjusted his expensive suit jacket and stepped forward to validate his wife's entirely fabricated story. "I told her no?" Julian chimed in, shaking his head and looking down at me with utter contempt. "I told her I was not going to finance a lavish wedding just so she could pretend to be on our level. She told me her public relations firm was drowning in corporate debt and she needed cash immediately to make payroll. I offered to help her find a financial advisor, but I refused to hand over my hard-earned money to fund her delusions. That is why she is so angry today. She expected a free ride into our family and we finally cut her off." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I had never asked Julian for a single dime in my entire life. In fact, I made more in a single financial quarter managing crisis accounts for state politicians than Julian made in 2 full years at his middle management position. But the wealthy relatives ate the lie right out of the palm of Chloe's hand. They began murmuring among themselves, nodding their heads, as if all the pieces of the puzzle had finally clicked together. Of course, the girl from the South Side was broke. Of course, she was trying to leech off the golden child of the family. It fit their prejudiced narrative so perfectly, they did not even bother to question the logic or demand proof. Aunt Beatrice glared at me, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest, as if she thought I might lunge forward and try to steal her wallet right there in the parking lot. You should be absolutely ashamed of yourself, Zariah. Beatrice spat, her voice loud and trembling with righteous indignation. Trying to extort money from your future brother-in-law and then throwing a violent tantrum when he responsibly says no. You are a complete disgrace. Marcus, you need to call off this engagement immediately before she drains your bank accounts completely and ruins your credit. Marcus, still standing beside his mother, nodded slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, looking like a man who had narrowly escaped a tragic fate. I am sorry, everyone, Marcus muttered, looking at the ground, instead of making eye contact with me. I really thought she was different. I thought she was independent and successful, but I guess my mother and Chloe were right all along. She was just using me. I stood completely still, letting their collective judgment wash over me. My crisis management training kicked into high gear. I knew that the harder they pushed this false narrative, the more devastating the truth was going to be when it finally hit them. I did not cross my arms defensively. I did not frown or yell. I let a slow, deliberate half-smile form on my lips. I locked my eyes onto Chloe. She was smiling back, a triumphant, smug little smirk that told me she thought she had brilliantly checkmated me in front of the entire family. She thought her fabricated story had effectively neutralized my earlier comments about her tax evasion. She thought she was invincible, standing on her pedestal of white privilege and generational wealth. I took one slow step forward. The murmurs of the crowd died down instantly. Hundreds of eyes locked onto me. Everyone was waiting to see my reaction, expecting me to scream or cry, or desperately try to defend my ruined reputation. Instead, I spoke with a voice so calm and so measured it sent a visible chill through the front row of relatives. Are you absolutely sure about that story, Chloe? I asked, tilting my head slightly to the side. Are you completely certain that I came to your husband begging for a loan? Chloe's smirk widened. She crossed her arms over her inappropriate white lace dress, looking down at me from her elevated spot on the curb. Do not try to backtrack now, Zariah, Chloe said smoothly, acting like a generous victor, giving a defeated enemy a chance to surrender. Julian and I have the text messages. We were going to keep it a secret to save you the embarrassment, but since you decided to attack me today, I think the family deserves to know the truth about your disastrous finances. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was not a bitter laugh or an angry one. It was the calm, confident laugh of someone holding a royal flush while watching their opponent bet their entire life savings on a pair of twos. That is incredibly fascinating, I replied, keeping my eyes pinned to her pale face, ensuring she could not look away from me. Because I just checked my corporate accounts this morning with my accounting team. And I am trying to figure out how a woman who is supposedly begging for a loan somehow managed to wire exactly $150,000 into your personal business account last Tuesday. The parking lot went dead silent. The kind of suffocating silence where you could hear the wind rustling the leaves on the trees and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I took another step closer, narrowing my eyes, my smile fading into a look of absolute lethal precision. Are you sure I borrowed money from your husband? I asked, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a sharp cutting edge that sliced right through her arrogance. And not that my $150,000 wedding fund is currently sitting in your offshore holding account to cover the massive catastrophic losses of your tax-evading fashion company. The transformation on Chloe's face was instantaneous and absolutely glorious to witness. The smug, triumphant smirk vanished, as if it had been physically slapped right off her jaw. All the blood drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale ghost standing in the bright afternoon sun. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted frantically toward Vivian, seeking a lifeline that was no longer there. Vivian's reaction was even worse. The fake tears she had been crying instantly dried up. She took a sudden, sharp breath, stepping back so quickly she nearly tripped over the hem of her emerald green designer gown. Her hands began to shake visibly, and she grabbed onto Marcus' arm not for theatrical effect, but because her knees were genuinely giving out beneath her. The relatives who had just been loudly condemning me suddenly turned their heads, looking back and forth between my calm, composed face and the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from Chloe and Vivian. Aunt Beatrice frowned, stepping away from Chloe looking confused and suddenly deeply suspicious. The wealthy crowd realized in an instant that the women they had been defending were hiding something massive. "What is she talking about?" Chloe Julian demanded, his voice entirely losing its confident, arrogant edge. He looked at his wife, expecting her to immediately fire back with another clever insult or a swift denial. But Chloe was completely frozen. She could not speak. Her breath was hitching in her throat, and her hands were trembling so badly she nearly dropped her iced coffee cup. "Tell him, Chloe." I encouraged, my voice dripping with sweet, poisonous politeness. "Tell your husband how you and Vivian forged the routing numbers on the venue catering contract. Tell him how you redirected the money I paid for this banquet hall straight into your failing business account to stop the federal auditors from freezing your assets on Wednesday morning. Or did you somehow forget to mention to Julian that you are currently under active investigation for federal wire fraud?" The shockwave of my words hung in the air for only a fraction of a second before the entire parking lot erupted into absolute chaos. Julian grabbed Chloe by the shoulders violently, turning her to face him, demanding to know if what I said was true. Chloe burst into genuine hysterical tears, burying her face in her hands, refusing to answer him. That silent confirmation was all it took for Vivian to completely lose her mind. The carefully constructed mask of the elegant, wealthy matriarch shattered into a million pieces, revealing the desperate, cornered animal hiding underneath. Vivian let out a guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged forward, her manicured hands curled into sharp claws, aiming directly for my face. "How dare you!" she screamed, her voice cracking with wild desperation. "How dare you speak to us like this, you ungrateful little brat!" She swung her right arm back, intending to deliver a devastating slap across my cheek in front of hundreds of people. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply raised my left forearm and blocked her wrist mid-swing. The sound of her heavy diamond bracelets crashing against my gold watch echoed sharply in the tense air. I shoved her arm back toward her with just enough deliberate force to make her stumble backward into Marcus. This was the moment Marcus finally found his voice. But he did not use it to defend the woman he was supposed to marry against a blatant physical assault. He used it to protect his mother. Marcus caught Vivian by the waist, steadying her before stepping directly into my personal space. His face was twisted with an ugly, furious red flush. His chest heaved as he towered over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "What the hell is wrong with you, Zariah?" he roared, his voice booming across the concrete parking lot. "You just physically assaulted my mother." I looked up at him, completely disgusted by his sheer cowardice. "She just tried to hit me, Marcus," I said, keeping my tone dangerously level. "Your mother and your sister-in-law stole $150,000 from me. They committed a federal crime, and you are standing here yelling at me for defending myself against her attack." Marcus did not care about the missing money. He did not care about the truth of the wire fraud or the blatant disrespect his family had shown me. He only cared about the hundreds of wealthy relatives staring at him, waiting to see how the golden boy of the family would handle this embarrassing public spectacle. He needed to reassert his dominance, and he chose the most humiliating way possible to try and break me. "Get on your knees," he ordered, his voice dropping to a vicious, demanding growl. I blinked, staring at him as if he had just started speaking a completely foreign language. "Excuse me," I asked softly, my voice dangerously quiet. "Get on your knees right now and apologize to my mother and my sister-in-law," Marcus shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the hard asphalt beneath my feet. "You have completely humiliated this family today. You made up these insane, toxic lies about wire fraud and tax evasion just because you are bitter about the venue getting canceled. You are acting like a wild animal. Get down on the ground, apologize for smearing our honor, and then take your trashy family and get the hell out of my sight." I am absolutely done with you." The sheer audacity of his demand sent a massive shockwave of adrenaline straight through my veins. He actually expected me, an independent, wildly successful grown woman, to kneel on the dirty concrete and beg for forgiveness from the very people who had just robbed me blind. But before I could even formulate a response to his insane demand, the wealthy mob of relatives decided to join the execution. Aunt Beatrice stepped forward, her face completely flushed with self-righteous outrage. "You heard him!" she shrieked, pointing her designer clutch directly at my chest. "Get on your knees and apologize to Vivian this instant. You come from absolutely nothing and you tried to destroy good, honest, wealthy people because of your own twisted, raging jealousy. You are a complete disgrace." Uncle Charles chimed in, his voice booming with arrogant authority over the crowd. "Call the police," he demanded, waving his hands frantically toward the main street. "This woman is violent and unstable. She attacked Vivian unprovoked and she is trespassing on private property. We need to have her and her entire family removed immediately before she hurts someone else." The crowd surged forward, pressing in around me. The physical space between us shrank rapidly, creating a suffocating, claustrophobic wall of hostile, aggressive faces. I was suddenly surrounded by a sea of expensive, tailored suits and designer dresses, all twisted into expressions of pure, ugly hatred. They were pointing fingers, shouting vile insults, and demanding my absolute physical and emotional submission. They wanted me broken. They wanted to see me kneeling on the concrete, crying and begging for mercy from the elite family I had dared to challenge. I could hear my father shouting from the other side of the parking lot. His deep, powerful voice cut through the noise of the wealthy crowd, demanding that they step away from his daughter immediately. I saw my uncles moving forward, rapidly rolling up the sleeves of their dress shirts, ready to fight their way through the wall of socialites to get to me. The situation was seconds away from turning into a massive, violent physical brawl. I turned my head quickly and locked eyes with my father, holding my hand up high and flat. It was our universal signal to stop. He hesitated, his face contorted with fierce anger and protective panic, but he trusted me implicitly. He planted his feet, holding my mother back, and waited to see my next move. I turned my attention back to Marcus. The man who had promised to love and cherish me for the rest of his life was standing there, with his arms crossed tightly across his chest, waiting for me to kneel. The absolute isolation of that exact moment was profound and chilling. I was surrounded by hundreds of shouting people, yet I was entirely alone, in the very center of their collective hatred. They looked at me not as a human being, but as a pest that desperately needed to be eradicated. They truly believed that their wealth and their social status gave them the absolute unshakable right to demand my subjugation. Marcus took another aggressive step closer, leaning down so his face was mere inches from mine. "Did you hear me?" He spat, his breath hot, and smelling faintly of the expensive scotch he had been drinking in the limousine earlier. "Kneel down and apologize, Zariah. Or I swear to God, I will make sure your little public relations business is completely destroyed in this city by tomorrow morning. My father plays golf with the mayor and half the city council. We will absolutely ruin your entire life." I looked deeply into Marcus' eyes and saw absolutely nothing of the man I thought I knew. The charming smile, the gentle promises, the late-night conversations about our beautiful future together, it was all a perfectly constructed hollow facade. Underneath the expensive clothes and the polished country club manners, he was nothing more than a weak, arrogant boy who would gladly sacrifice the woman he supposedly loved on the altar of his family-toxic ego. The realization did not break my heart. It completely and utterly liberated me. Every single ounce of doubt, lingering affection, or sadness I had for him evaporated into the warm afternoon air. I was free. I was standing in the middle of a screaming hostile mob facing the absolute worst they had to offer, and I had never felt more completely in control of my own destiny. Vivian had recovered from her momentary panic, now fully empowered by the aggressive protection of her son and her wealthy peers. She stepped out from behind Marcus, her chest puffed out with arrogant, triumphant pride. "You heard my son. she said, her voice dripping with venomous malice. "You are absolutely nothing to us. You are just a mistake he made, and now we are finally correcting it. Kneel down and beg for our forgiveness, and maybe we will be generous enough not to press felony charges for assault." They honestly thought they had trapped me. They thought the sheer weight of their numbers, their loud, aggressive threats, and their social standing would successfully crush me into compliance. They fully expected me to crumble under the suffocating pressure of their absolute isolation. I did not move. I did not speak right away. I let their screaming wash over me, letting the vile insults and the outrageous demands echo off the concrete walls of the locked banquet hall. I wanted every single one of them to firmly commit to this terrible moment. I wanted them to be absolutely certain of their complete victory so that the devastating reality of their destruction would be that much sweeter. The crowd was still screaming around me, hurling insults and demanding my absolute submission. Marcus was still pointing aggressively at the hard asphalt, demanding that I get on my knees to apologize to the very women who had just robbed me. I did not bend my knees. I did not lower my head. I maintained a perfectly straight posture and let a profound, terrifying calmness settle over my entire body. I knew that arguing with an irrational, hostile mob was a completely useless endeavor. My professional training in crisis public relations had taught me that when the opposition is loud and aggressive, the absolute best weapon is hard, undeniable evidence presented in the most public way possible. I reached my right hand down the smooth silk fabric of my custom wedding gown and slipped my fingers into a hidden side pocket. The crowd noticed the subtle movement immediately. A ripple of nervous energy passed through the front row of wealthy relatives. Uncle Charles took a half step backward, perhaps thinking I was reaching for some kind of physical weapon. Aunt Beatrice clutched her expensive pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. When I slowly pulled out my cell phone, a collective sigh of relief washed over them. Marcus let out a harsh, mocking laugh, throwing his hands up in the air in theatrical frustration. "What exactly are you doing, Zariah?" He sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Are you calling your little lawyer? Are you going to record us and cry about it on social media? Put the phone away and get down on the concrete like I told you. You are making things so much worse for yourself." I did not look at him. I did not acknowledge his pathetic attempt to regain control of the situation. I slowly turned my body, letting my gaze sweep across the sea of angry faces, before locking my eyes onto the massive black Lincoln Navigator that Vivian had arrived in just a few minutes earlier. In her dramatic rush to step out and publicly humiliate me, she had left the heavy engine running. I could hear the low, steady hum of its powerful motor vibrating against the asphalt. The windows were rolled down slightly to let the warm afternoon air circulate through the luxurious leather interior. What none of these arrogant people realized was that I had spent the entire day yesterday running errands with Vivian in that exact vehicle. During that agonizing 4-hour trip, picking up last-minute floral arrangements and dealing with her constant passive-aggressive insults, she had asked me to connect my phone to the vehicle entertainment system so she could listen to a specific jazz playlist. She had been too busy ordering me around to ever ask me to unpair my device from the digital dashboard. I unlocked my screen with a simple swipe of my thumb. The bright display illuminated my calm expression. I opened my system settings and tapped the Bluetooth icon. A list of available devices populated on the screen instantly, and right at the top in bold letters was the customized name of Vivian Luxury Sport Utility Vehicle. I pressed connect. Vivian noticed me staring intently at her idling vehicle. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed her face, momentarily replacing her mask of arrogant rage. "What are you doing?" she demanded, stepping away from Marcus and marching a few steps toward me. "Stop playing stupid games on your phone and answer my son. You are making an absolute fool of yourself in front of the entire family." I did not answer her. I opened my Secure Files application. As a crisis management executive handling high-stakes political and corporate scandals, I never walked into a hostile environment without a fail-safe. I had spent years dealing with corrupt politicians, lying corporate executives, and fraudulent business partners. I learned very early in my career that the truth is completely useless unless you can prove it with undeniable audio or visual evidence. I had a specific encrypted folder on my phone dedicated to this exact family. I scrolled past several documents until I found the specific audio file I had secured just 2 days ago. It was a recording I had captured through a completely legal digital audit of my own company communication lines. When you run a firm that handles highly sensitive corporate data, your phone systems are automatically recorded for quality assurance and legal protection. Chloe and Vivian had been arrogant and careless enough to call my office line while I was out to lunch, leaving a detailed voicemail that they thought went to a private, unmonitored inbox. They had absolutely no idea my security protocols captured every single spoken word and stored it in a cloud database. I tapped the file. A small loading circle spun on my screen for exactly 2 seconds. Those 2 seconds felt like an absolute eternity. The wealthy crowd around me was growing restless again, murmuring insults and demanding that someone call the police to have me physically removed from the premises. Marcus was taking another aggressive step toward me, his face flushed with anger, preparing to physically grab my arm and force me to the ground. Then the loud, unmistakable electronic chime of a successful Bluetooth pairing echoed out of the premium surround sound speakers of the black Lincoln Navigator. The sudden sharp noise startled everyone. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, his hand hovering frozen in the air. Vivian spun around to look at her idling vehicle, her eyes wide with sudden apprehension. The massive crowd of relatives fell completely silent, trying to understand why the luxury vehicle was suddenly interacting with my device. I looked directly at Chloe. She was still hiding behind Aunt Beatrice, but her pale face was twisted with a sudden sickening realization. She understood what was happening just a fraction of a second before everyone else did. She opened her mouth to scream, to tell someone to turn the car off, to do absolutely anything to stop what was coming next. But she could not find her voice. It was entirely too late. I pressed the deadly play button on my screen. The audio did not just play, it exploded out of the 24 premium speakers installed throughout the massive luxury vehicle. The volume had been set to maximum from Vivian's previous dramatic entrance, and the digital sound quality was absolutely crystal clear. The voices echoed across the locked glass doors of the grand atrium, bounced off the concrete pavement, and washed over the 600 guests standing in the dead silent parking lot. Vivian's voice came first, loud, arrogant, and dripping with the exact same condescension she had used on me just moments ago. But this time she was not talking to me. She was talking to her favorite daughter-in-law. "I just got off the phone with the property manager," the recorded voice of Vivian boomed across the parking lot. "That stupid girl actually wired the full $150,000 directly into the account we gave her. She did not even double-check the routing numbers. She just signed the contract and authorized the transfer." Then Chloe's voice answered through the speakers, sounding breathless and entirely giddy with wicked excitement. "Oh my God, Vivian, you are an absolute genius. This is going to save my entire lifestyle brand. The federal auditors were going to freeze all my corporate assets by Friday morning if I did not deposit at least $100,000 into the holding account to cover the back taxes. This completely covers my deficit with the Internal Revenue Service." The parking lot was so incredibly quiet, you could have heard a pin drop on the concrete. The only sound in the entire world was the damning audio of two wealthy, arrogant women casually admitting to a massive federal crime. Uncle Charles' jaw actually dropped open. Aunt Beatrice slowly turned her head to look at Chloe, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Vivian's recorded voice came back through the speakers, sounding dismissive and breathtakingly cruel. "We just need to figure out how to explain the canceled venue on Saturday. I will just tell the family that her little public relations firm went bankrupt and she bounced the checks for the catering. They already hate her because she is from the South Side. They will believe absolutely anything negative I tell them about her. Marcus will be embarrassed, but he will get over it. We can just tell him she called off the wedding out of shame because she could not afford it." Chloe's recorded voice laughed, a sharp, nasty sound that made Julian physically flinch away from his wife. "It is almost too easy," the recorded voice of Chloe said, echoing through the massive speakers. That public relations girl is so stupid and busy, she will not even check the financial receipts until it is way too late. And by then, the money will be completely untraceable through my offshore holding accounts. She is just another dumb girl trying to buy her way into our family, and we just made her pay the ultimate admission fee. I reached down and tapped my phone screen, pausing the audio. The silence that rushed back into the parking lot was heavy, suffocating, and completely absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The wealthy relatives who had just been screaming at me to get on my knees were completely frozen, staring at the black Lincoln Navigator as if it were a highly explosive bomb that had just detonated right in their faces. I kept my finger resting lightly against the glass screen of my phone, allowing the terrifying silence to completely paralyze them. I wanted Vivian and Chloe to feel the exact moment their entire world began to collapse. I watched their faces closely, absorbing every twitch, every nervous swallow, and every drop of sweat forming beneath their expensive makeup. Then I pressed the play button a second time. The audio recording resumed instantly, blasting through the 24 premium speakers of the Lincoln Navigator with brutal clarity. The voices picked up right where they had left off, delving even deeper into the mechanics of their massive federal crime. I am telling you, Vivian. The recorded voice of Chloe echoed across the parking lot, sounding frantic and desperate. The Federal Bureau of Investigation sent an agent to my corporate office on Monday. They are auditing my entire lifestyle brand. If they look at the offshore accounts and see the deficit, I am going to federal prison. I need a slush fund immediately. I need untraceable cash to balance the ledgers before they issue a formal subpoena for my hard drives. Through the speakers, Vivian let out a long, exasperated sigh that sounded incredibly loud in the dead quiet of the afternoon. "Calm down, Chloe," the recorded voice of my mother-in-law snapped. "I already told you I have it completely handled." Marcus gave me the finalized contracts for the venue and the premium catering to review before Zariah signed them. I simply swapped the banking details on the final page. I put the routing numbers for your holding company instead of the Grand Atrium corporate account. When she authorizes the wire transfer on Tuesday morning, the entire $150,000 will drop straight into your slush fund. But what if she notices Chloe's recorded voice asked her panic evident even through the digital compression of the audio file? What if she calls the venue to confirm the deposit? That was when the laugh happened. It was a sharp, cruel, mocking laugh from Chloe herself, completely captured by my office security system. The sound of her own wicked laughter echoing across the concrete seemed to physically strike the real Chloe standing in the parking lot. "Oh, please," Chloe's recorded voice said, her tone dripping with arrogant condescension. "That PR girl is so stupid and busy, she will not even check the receipts. She works 80 hours a week dealing with politicians. She just signs whatever paper is put in front of her. She completely trusts Marcus, and Marcus completely trusts you. We are going to take her money, save my company, and she will not figure it out until Saturday when she shows up to a locked building." I took my eyes off my phone and focused entirely on the women standing in front of me. The physical transformation of Vivian and Chloe was absolutely spectacular to witness. The camera of my own memory zoomed in perfectly on their faces, capturing every single detail of their utter destruction. Chloe's face had lost every single drop of its color. Her premium foundation suddenly looked like a layer of chalk smeared over pale, lifeless skin. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking so violently that the plastic iced coffee cup she was holding finally slipped from her grip. It crashed onto the concrete, splashing cold brown liquid and ice cubes across the toes of her expensive designer heels and the hem of her inappropriate white lace dress. She did not even flinch. Her pale blue eyes were locked onto the massive black sport utility vehicle, as if a monster was crawling out of the speakers. Her lower lip quivered uncontrollably, and she looked like she was struggling to draw oxygen into her lungs. Vivian looked even worse. The proud, wealthy matriarch of the family had completely physically collapsed inward. Her shoulders hunched forward, and her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. A thick bead of sweat rolled down her temple, ruining the perfect edge of her expensive hairstyle. She was staring at her own luxury vehicle with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The arrogant smirk she had worn just 10 minutes ago when she told me I belonged in the slums was completely gone. In its place was the horrifying realization that she had just confessed to felony wire fraud conspiracy and embezzlement in front of 600 witnesses. But the audio file was not finished yet. I had let it play because there was one final piece of the conversation that the rest of the family desperately needed to hear. "What about Marcus?" the recorded voice of Chloe asked, sounding slightly nervous again. "What is your son going to do when his bride shows up to an empty parking lot on their wedding day? Will he not demand to know where the money went? Will he not investigate the property management company?" Vivian recorded voice let out a dismissive snort. "Marcus will do exactly what I tell him to do," the audio blasted across the lot. "He is weak, Chloe. You know that, and I know that. He hates confrontation, and he hates public scandal. When Zaria throws a fit about the locked doors, I will just flip the narrative. I will tell the entire family that she went bankrupt and lied to us. Marcus will be so embarrassed by the social humiliation that he will just beg her to cancel everything to make the drama go away. He will never look into the finances because he is too terrified of what people might think of him. He is a spineless boy, but his cowardice is going to save your business." I reached down and tapped my screen, stopping the audio file completely. The silence that followed was entirely different from the previous one. This was not the silence of shock. This was the heavy, dangerous silence of a massive social ecosystem violently turning on its own members. I looked at Marcus. The man who had just ordered me to get on my knees and apologize to his mother was staring at Vivian with an expression of complete devastation. His face was gray. The audio had not just exposed a financial crime. It had exposed the deep, profound lack of respect his own mother had for him. She had called him weak. She had called him a spineless boy. She had orchestrated the complete destruction of his wedding day and the robbery of his future wife simply because she knew he would be too much of a coward to ever stand up to her. Marcus' jaw worked silently, opening and closing, but no words came out. He looked absolutely, entirely broken. Julian reacted much differently. The protective, arrogant husband persona he had been wearing completely vanished. He slowly turned his head to look at Chloe, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and growing rage. "You told me your company was fine," Julian whispered, his voice carrying in the dead quiet of the parking lot. "You told me the federal auditors found nothing. You dragged me into this parking lot to defend you against a woman whose money you stole to keep yourself out of federal prison." Chloe reached out a trembling hand toward him, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, ruining her mascara. "Julian, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "I can explain. It was Vivian's idea. She told me it was the only way to save the brand." "Do not touch me," Julian roared, slapping her hand away with such force that Chloe stumbled backward, almost tripping over the curb. "You are a criminal. You just confessed to federal wire fraud on a recording." The wealthy relatives who had been ready to call the police on me just moments ago were now physically backing away from Vivian and Chloe, as if the two women were carrying a highly contagious disease. Aunt Beatrice dropped her hands to her sides, shaking her head in absolute disgust. Uncle Charles took 3 large steps backward, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the matriarch he had just been defending. In their world of elite social status, losing money was a mistake, but getting caught committing a federal crime was an unforgivable sin. The socialite crowd did not care about the morality of the theft. They cared about the scandal. They cared about the fact that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was now directly tied to their family name. They turned their backs on Vivian and Chloe in perfect unison. The wall of wealthy, hostile faces that had been aggressively pressing in on me just moments before completely dissolved. The arrogant relatives were now whispering furiously to each other, pulling out their cell phones, looking for the fastest way to distance themselves from the impending legal disaster. I stood in the exact center of the chaos, perfectly still and completely untouched. I had not yelled, I had not thrown a single punch, I had not dropped to my knees or shed a single tear. I had simply let them speak their own truth into a microphone and allowed their own toxic arrogance to entirely destroy them. I looked at Vivian, pale, sweating face, and Chloe, weeping, pathetic form. They had tried to lock me out of my own future. Instead, they had just handed me the key to their absolute destruction. The silence in the parking lot was suddenly broken by the sound of Marcus taking a heavy, shaking breath. I watched the conflicting emotions war across his face. He had just heard his own mother call him a spineless boy. He had just learned that his entire wedding was a massive financial scam orchestrated by the people he trusted most. A real man would have turned to his mother and demanded accountability. A real partner would have turned to me and begged for my forgiveness. But Marcus was neither of those things. As the wealthy relatives continued to back away and whisper among themselves, his fragile ego could not handle the public humiliation of being the victim of his own family. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to regain control of the narrative before his reputation was completely destroyed in front of his peers. He turned away from Vivian and locked his eyes on me. The sadness in his expression instantly hardened into a mask of irrational, furious anger. He marched across the concrete, stopping just 2 feet in front of me. His fists were balled tightly at his sides and his chest heaved with shallow, angry breaths. I expected him to yell at his mother, but instead he aimed all of his venom directly at me. "Why would you do this, Zariah?" he hissed, his voice trembling with misdirected rage. "Why would you play that in front of everyone? You planned this just to embarrass me." I stared at him, completely baffled by his twisted logic. "I embarrassed you," I asked, my voice steady and unyielding. "Your mother and your sister-in-law stole a fortune from my business account and locked us out of our own wedding, but you are angry at me for exposing them." Marcus shook his head furiously, refusing to accept the reality of the situation. "It does not matter," he shouted, throwing his arms wide, gesturing to the empty locked building. "We are getting married today. Your money becomes our family money once we are married anyway. It is all the exact same pool of resources. If Chloe needed the cash to save her business, we would have helped her eventually. You are blowing this completely out of proportion. How dare you record my mother in a private conversation? How dare you treat my family like a bunch of common criminals?" I looked at the man I had almost bound my life to and felt a deep, profound wave of relief that the wedding had been canceled. "You do not understand how the law works, Marcus," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "Marriage is a partnership, not a financial meat shield for your criminal relatives. Stealing corporate funds is not a family loan. It is a federal felony. And for the record, they called my office line. My corporate security protocols automatically record all incoming communications. They handed me their confession on a silver platter." Vivian, hearing her son actively defend her, suddenly found a tiny scrap of her lost arrogance. She pushed past Marcus, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are going to jail for this!" Vivian shrieked, her voice hoarse and desperate. "You cannot just record people without their permission. I am going to sue you for everything you own. I am going to take your little public relations firm and burn it to the ground. You are a disgusting, manipulative snake." I did not even get the chance to respond to Vivian's absurd legal threats. Before I could explain the concept of corporate security to her, the distant wail of a heavy siren cut through the warm afternoon air. The sound was sharp and piercing, echoing off the concrete walls of the locked banquet hall. The entire crowd froze, turning their heads toward the main street. Aunt Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest. Uncle Charles took another step back, looking frantically around the parking lot. Marcus spun around, his angry face suddenly draining of all remaining color. The camera of my memory pulled focus, perfectly shifting from the terrified sweat on Marcus' forehead to the flashing lights approaching the main gates. But these were not the standard red and blue lights of the Atlanta Police Department. These were bright, flashing white strobe lights attached to the massive roofs of heavy commercial diesel trucks. The heavy iron gates swung open wider as 3 massive broadcast vans roared into the parking lot. The loud, aggressive honk of an air horn shattered the remaining tension. I recognized the logos painted on the sides of the vehicles immediately. It was Channel 5, Channel 8, and the largest premier news network in the entire state of Georgia. The vans did not park politely in the designated spaces. They pulled up aggressively, jumping the curb slightly, and forming a tight semicircle right in the middle of the VIP drop-off lane, effectively blocking Vivian luxury vehicle from leaving. The side doors of the van slid open before the vehicles even came to a complete stop. A highly coordinated army of media professionals poured out onto the concrete. Camera operators hoisted massive heavy broadcast cameras onto their shoulders, adjusting their lenses and flipping on their blinding bright light, emitting diode spotlights. Sound technicians uncoiled thick black cables holding long boom microphones high in the air. Reporters in sharp, tailored suits began speaking rapidly into their handheld microphones, practicing their live introductions as they marched directly toward our fractured group. The realization hit the wealthy relatives like a physical blow. This was no longer a private family dispute. This was no longer a quiet scandal that could be swept under the rug with a few phone calls and a generous donation to a local charity. This was a massive public spectacle. Vivian let out a high-pitched wail, covering her face with her hands, as the bright white spotlights hit her, directly illuminating every single drop of sweat and ruined makeup on her face. Chloe collapsed against the side of the white sports car, sobbing uncontrollably, trying to hide from the camera lenses pointing directly at her trembling form. The socialite crowd scattered like cockroaches in the light. Men in expensive suits threw their suit jackets over their heads, speed walking toward their luxury sedans. Women in designer dresses turned their backs to the cameras, hiding their faces behind their expensive handbags. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a family currently being swarmed by the local news for federal tax evasion and wire fraud. Marcus turned back to me, his eyes wide with absolute horror. The arrogant, demanding posture he had held just seconds ago completely vanished, replaced by sheer panic. "What did you do, Zariah?" he whispered, his voice cracking completely. "Tell them to leave. Tell them this is a private event. My father company is going public next month. If this gets on the news, it will destroy everything we have built." I looked at his terrified face, bathed in the harsh, bright light of the television cameras. I smiled a cold, professional smile. "I told you I handle crisis public relations for a living, Marcus," I said, my voice carrying perfectly over the sound of the idling news vans. "But I never said I was going to handle your crisis. I am the one who created it." The lead reporter from Channel 5 shoved her way past Julian, stepping right up to the edge of the curb. Her camera operator followed close behind, keeping the lens focused entirely on the panicked faces of Vivian and Chloe. "Are we live?" the reporter asked her producer through her earpiece. She nodded sharply, confirming the signal before turning her professional television smile toward the camera. "Good afternoon, Atlanta," the reporter announced, her voice projecting clearly across the chaotic parking lot. "We are reporting live from the Grand Atrium Banquet Hall, where a high society wedding has just violently imploded. We have received exclusive audio evidence regarding a massive wire fraud and tax evasion scandal directly involving the owners of a prominent local fashion brand." Julian grabbed Chloe by the arm, trying to drag her toward their white sports car, but a second camera crew immediately blocked their path. "Do not touch my camera!" Julian yelled, holding his hand up to block the blinding light. "We have no comment. Turn that thing off right now, or I am calling my lawyers." Nobody cared about his lawyers. The media had smelled blood in the water, and they were not going to leave until they had every single detail on tape. A third reporter approached Vivian, holding a microphone just inches from her terrified face. "Ma'am," the reporter asked loudly, "is it true that you conspired to embezzle $150,000 from your future daughter-in-law? Do you have any comment on the federal investigation into your family finances?" Vivian could not speak. She simply stood there, frozen in the spotlight, her entire legacy crumbling into dust on live television. I watched the chaotic scene unfold, feeling an overwhelming sense of justice. They had tried to push me into the shadows, but I had brought the brightest lights in the city right to their doorstep. The harsh glare of the television spotlights continued to sweep across the concrete, creating long, dramatic shadows against the locked glass doors of the Grand Atrium. The camera operators moved with fluid, practiced precision, their heavy broadcast lenses balanced perfectly on Steadicam rigs as they tracked through the chaotic parking lot. The sheer presence of the media was overwhelming. But what was truly fascinating was watching the psychological collapse of the women who had tried to destroy me. Vivian blinked rapidly against the blinding white lights, her mind clearly fracturing under the immense pressure of the moment. Instead of confessing to the crime or turning around and running away from the cameras, her deeply ingrained narcissism took complete control of her rational thought. She actually let out a loud, artificial laugh, waving her manicured hand dismissively at the reporter who had just questioned her about the embezzlement. "Oh, you people are absolutely relentless!" Vivian projected her voice, putting on a sickly sweet tone that she normally reserved for charity galas and country club luncheons. "This is all just a massive, silly misunderstanding. We are filming a pilot for a new reality television show about elite Atlanta families. That audio recording was completely scripted drama for the cameras. Now, if you would please step back, we have a grand high society wedding to attend to." It was the most pathetic, desperate attempt at a cover-up I had ever witnessed in my entire professional career. Vivian honestly believed she could manipulate seasoned investigative journalists the same way she manipulated her wealthy, gullible relatives. She thought she could just smile for the cameras, lie through her teeth, and completely rewrite reality on live television. Chloe, seeing Vivian pivot, immediately grabbed onto the delusional lifeline. The panic that had just paralyzed her vanished instantly, replaced by the fame-hungry desperation of a failed lifestyle influencer who suddenly found herself surrounded by national media. Chloe hurriedly wiped the running mascara from beneath her pale blue eyes. She smoothed down the front of her ruined white lace dress, ignoring the coffee stains on her expensive shoes. She took a step forward, positioning herself directly beside Vivian. She reached up and hastily fluffed her blonde hair, throwing her shoulders back and sucking in her stomach. More camera crews were sprinting across the asphalt, emerging from the second and third broadcast vans. Among them were the famous lead anchors from the premier network evening news programs, the journalists who only covered the most exclusive high-profile stories in the state. Vivian and Chloe saw these famous faces approaching, and their vanity completely overrode their sense of self-preservation. They genuinely thought the media had arrived to cover their family as the pinnacle of Atlanta high society. They thought they were about to be featured in a sprawling television special about the wedding of the century. Vivian stood tall, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace and pasting a tragic but beautiful smile onto her face. Chloe struck her signature influencer pose, jutting her hip out to the side, resting a hand on her waist, and offering a practiced, perfectly angled pout toward the approaching lenses. They stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the pathway, expecting the famous anchors to stop and ask them about their designer dresses, their exclusive guest list, and the glamorous life of the city, absolute elite. The Steadicam operators did not even slow their pace. They marched straight toward the two posing women carrying the heavy equipment with aggressive momentum. Vivian held her smile, widening it as the first major anchor stepped right up to the curb. She opened her mouth, preparing to deliver a rehearsed monologue about her family legacy. But the anchor did not stop. She walked right past Vivian without even a sideways glance. The Steadicam operator followed immediately behind the anchor, physically brushing past Chloe with so much forward momentum that the heavy black camera battery pack clipped Chloe in the shoulder, forcing her to stumble backward. "Watch your back," a sound technician barked impatiently, jogging right past the two women while unspooling a thick coil of audio cable. The rush of wind from the passing media professionals fluttered the hem of Vivian Emerald green gown. The entire fleet of reporters, camera operators, and producers marched right past the so-called Golden Family of Atlanta as if they were completely, entirely invisible. The cameras did not care about Vivian diamond necklace. They did not care about Chloe ruined white lace dress or her practiced influencer pout. They completely bypassed the women who had spent their entire lives demanding to be the center of attention, reducing them to nothing more than irrelevant obstacles standing in the way of the real story. The look of absolute shock on Vivian's face was priceless. Her artificial smile froze and then slowly melted away, leaving her mouth hanging slightly open in pure disbelief. Chloe dropped her posed stance, her arms falling limply to her sides as she turned her head to watch the cameras walk away from her. They had dressed up, They had posed, they had prepared for their grand media debut, and the media had treated them like pieces of discarded furniture. The steady stream of journalists converged directly on me. They formed a tight professional semicircle around where I stood. The Steadicam operators circled me smoothly, keeping my calm, unbothered expression perfectly centered in their framing. A dozen microphones bearing the brightly colored logos of every major news network in the state were thrust toward me simultaneously. The bright white spotlights illuminated my custom silk gown, making the fabric shine brilliantly against the dark backdrop of the locked venue. I did not flinch from the lights. I did not shrink away from the cameras. I stood my ground looking directly into the primary lens, with the absolute confidence of a woman who was entirely in control of the narrative. I had spent years standing behind the cameras managing the public image of powerful people. Now I was standing in front of them and I knew exactly how to command the space. Director Zaraya, the famous lead anchor from Channel 8, asked, her voice projecting clearly over the chaotic noise of the parking lot. "We received the encrypted press release from your corporate office 30 minutes ago. Can you confirm that the audio recording we just heard was obtained legally through your firm internal security audits?" "Yes, I can confirm that," I replied, my voice smooth, measured, and perfectly pitched for broadcast television. My public relations firm handles highly sensitive corporate and political data. All of our communication lines are federally compliant and automatically recorded for security purposes. The individuals you heard on that recording willfully called a monitored corporate line and freely admitted to conspiracy and wire fraud. Another reporter pushed his microphone forward, his eyes wide with professional excitement. Director, the press release stated that the stolen funds were directed into a holding company currently under investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. Have you turned this evidence over to the federal authorities yet? The entire unedited audio file, along with the forged vendor contracts and the illegal routing numbers, were securely transmitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office exactly 1 hour ago. I stated calmly, making sure to articulate every single word clearly. I have also dispatched my legal team to file an emergency injunction to freeze all personal and corporate assets belonging to the individuals involved to prevent the stolen funds from being moved offshore. The reporters began firing questions in rapid succession, the camera shutters clicking furiously, capturing my every word. They did not ask me about my wedding dress. They did not ask me about the floral arrangements or the canceled catering. They were addressing me by my professional title, treating me with the profound respect reserved for high-level corporate executives and political power players. I glanced over the shoulders of the press pool and looked at Vivian and Chloe. They were standing completely isolated on the edge of the curb, watching the media swarm around me. The realization of what was actually happening was finally crashing down on them, crushing the very last remnants of their fame-hungry delusion. They were not the stars of a high society feature. They were the criminal subjects of a major investigative news broadcast, and I was the one directing the entire show. Marcus was standing a few feet away from his mother, staring at me through the gap in the camera crews. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a long coma, only to discover that the world he knew had been completely destroyed. He was finally seeing me not as the quiet, accommodating girl from the South Side who would blindly follow his family rules, but as the powerful, untouchable force I truly was. He had told me to get on my knees. Now he was standing frozen in the shadows, watching the entire city hang onto my every word. The Steadicam operators continued to glide around me, capturing the stunning visual contrast of the scene. On one side, the desperate wealthy family collapsing under the weight of their own arrogance and criminal exposure. On the other side, me standing tall, calm, and utterly victorious, in the center of the brightest lights in Atlanta. The transition of power was absolute, public, and completely televised. The camera angle shifted, dropping low to the pavement, looking up at me as I stood bathed in the brilliant white television lights. From this perspective, the towering glass facade of the grand atrium seemed to frame my silhouette, projecting an image of absolute, unshakable power. The reporters were practically fighting each other for the best microphone position, their questions overlapping in a chaotic wave of journalistic desperation. They were no longer treating this like a simple local news story about a canceled wedding. They were treating it like a major federal press conference, and I was the central authority figure commanding the entire narrative. Director Zaria, the lead anchor from Channel 5, shouted over the noise of the crowd. Can you please clarify your exact role for the viewers at home? The press release we received was issued by the Executive Board of Vanguard Strategic Communications. Are you representing them in a legal capacity today? I looked directly into the primary broadcast lens and offered a calm professional smile. I am not representing them, I replied, my voice echoing with absolute certainty. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Strategic Communications. I built the firm from the ground up 7 years ago, and I currently oversee all operations across our 3 corporate branches in Atlanta, Washington, and New York. The revelation hit the wealthy side of the family like a physical shockwave. A loud collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elite socialites who had been hurling insults at me just 20 minutes earlier. Aunt Beatrice physically stumbled backward, her jaw dropping wide open as she stared at me. Uncle Charles ripped his expensive sunglasses off his face, completely forgetting that the sun was already setting his eyes wide with absolute horror. They knew the name Vanguard Strategic Communications. Everyone in the Atlanta corporate sphere knew that name. It was the premier crisis management firm that handled the most sensitive billion-dollar mergers and high-stakes political campaigns in the entire Southeast. Chloe, who was still slumped against her white sports car, let out a pathetic whimpering sound. Just moments ago, she had confidently mocked me in front of hundreds of people, calling my life work a glorified babysitting service while boasting about her own failing lifestyle brand. The crushing reality of her massive miscalculation was finally settling into her fractured mind. She had not just insulted a successful woman. She had picked a public fight with a corporate titan who wielded enough media and political influence to destroy her entire existence with a single phone call. Vivian looked like she was going to pass out right there on the concrete. She grabbed onto the side mirror of her black Lincoln Navigator, struggling to keep herself upright. She had spent the entire morning bragging to her country club friends about how her son was doing a charitable deed by marrying a poor girl from the South Side. She had actively tried to ban my family from the venue, believing we were nothing more than uneducated working-class liabilities. Her profound arrogance had completely blinded her to the truth standing right in front of her. I turned my attention away from the cameras for a moment and swept my gaze across the divided parking lot. Marcus' family had assumed that every person wearing a designer suit or stepping out of a luxury vehicle was there exclusively for them. They believed their social standing was the only reason anyone important would ever attend this event. I decided it was time to completely dismantle that final pathetic delusion. I pointed a steady hand toward a small group of distinguished older men standing quietly near the edge of the media circle. You all assumed I was just a broke girl trying to hustle my way into your family legacy, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the cameras reaching every single relative in the parking lot. You assumed the VIP guests standing here today were your friends and your business partners. You thought your wealth was the only thing of value in this entire city. The crowd parted as a tall older man with striking silver hair and a meticulously tailored charcoal suit stepped forward. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at Vivian. He walked straight toward me, extending his hand with a warm, respectful smile. The flashbulbs of the press cameras exploded in a blinding frenzy as they immediately recognized his face. It was Senator Thomas, the senior state senator, and one of the most powerful political figures in Georgia. It is an absolute honor to be here, Zariah, the senator said, shaking my hand firmly while turning slightly to ensure the cameras caught his profile. Though I must admit, this is certainly the most exciting wedding reception I have ever attended. Vanguard Strategic Communications saved my re-election campaign last year, and I will always stand by the woman who made that victory possible. Vivian let out a strangled gasp. She had spent the last 2 months trying to secure a 5-minute meeting with Senator Thomas to discuss tax breaks for her husband's real estate company. She had been ignored by his office repeatedly. Now that exact same powerful man was standing in her parking lot, treating the woman she had just robbed with the utmost respect and public admiration. But the absolute worst was yet to come for Chloe. A second man stepped out from the group of distinguished guests, walking calmly to stand right beside the senator. He was wearing a sharp, dark navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase. His face was stern, his posture rigid and authoritative. He did not smile. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly past the reporters, fixing a terrifyingly cold stare right onto Chloe's pale, trembling face. "This is Director Vance," I announced, my voice ringing out like a death knell in the quiet parking lot. "He is the regional director of the Internal Revenue Service and a very close personal friend of my family. I actually invited him here today as a guest of honor to celebrate my marriage. But considering the audio evidence we all just listened to, I imagine his presence here is about to become strictly professional." Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream. She threw her hands over her ears, collapsing completely onto the hard concrete asphalt, no longer caring about her ruined dress, or the dozens of cameras broadcasting her breakdown live to the entire state. The man who had the power to sign her federal arrest warrants, the man who oversaw the exact agency she was desperately trying to defraud, was standing less than 30 feet away from her. He was not just a random government official. He was my personal guest. Director Vance nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Chloe's sobbing form. "We take allegations of federal wire fraud and tax evasion very seriously," he stated, his voice deep and authoritative, perfectly captured by the surrounding microphones. "Rest assured, my office will be initiating a comprehensive review of those offshore holding accounts first thing Monday morning. I appreciate your commitment to transparency, Zariah." Marcus finally broke. The sheer impossible weight of the reality crushing down on him was too much for his fragile, cowardly mind to process. He pushed his way through his horrified relatives, stumbling forward until he reached the edge of the media circle. He looked at me, then at the senator, then at the director of the Internal Revenue Service. He finally realized that the woman he had told to get on her knees was the most powerful person he would ever meet in his entire pathetic life. "Zariah, please," Marcus begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. His eyes were wide with desperate, pleading panic. He was no longer trying to protect his mother. He was no longer trying to act like a wealthy, superior gentleman. He was terrified. "My father company," he stammered, holding his hands out in a gesture of absolute defeat. "If the federal government investigates my mother, they will audit the entire family enterprise. We will lose absolutely everything. You have to tell them to stop. You have to fix this." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical indifference. The low angle of the cameras captured the exact moment the power dynamic permanently shifted. I was towering over him, a self-made titan of industry, looking down at a weak, spoiled boy who had tried to build his ego on my destruction. "I am a crisis manager, Marcus." I said, my words dropping like heavy stones onto the quiet pavement. "I fix problems for people who deserve to be saved. You and your family do not qualify for my services." The reporters immediately swarmed him, shoving microphones into his face, asking for a statement regarding his mother's criminal confession. Marcus scrambled backward, throwing his hands over his face, trying desperately to escape the relentless flashes of the cameras. He had wanted me to cancel the wedding and quietly disappear into the night to protect his fragile reputation. Instead, I had transformed his entire family into a cautionary tale that would be broadcast on every television screen in the country. The visual framing shifted immediately, simulating the direct feed of a live television broadcast. A small red recording indicator pulsed steadily in the upper corner of the screen, perfectly capturing the absolute magnitude of the moment. I looked straight into the camera lens, projecting the calm, authoritative demeanor that had made my public relations firm the most sought after in the state. The entire parking lot was hanging on to my every word, but I was no longer speaking just to the wealthy socialites or my terrified former fiancé. I was speaking directly to the millions of viewers tuning in across the region. I want to be absolutely clear with the public. I began, my voice steady and unwavering, carrying perfectly through the dozen microphones clustered in front of me. "There is no wedding taking place here today. What you are witnessing is an emergency press conference convened to expose a massive coordinated financial crime. A collective murmur rippled through the press pool as the journalists leaned in closer, their pens moving furiously across their notepads. The flashing strobe lights of the cameras reflected off the glass facade of the locked grand atrium, creating a surreal high-stakes atmosphere. For the past several weeks, I continued ensuring my tone remained clinical and completely detached from any personal emotion. I have been operating under the assumption that I was marrying into a respectable, prominent Atlanta family. I trusted them. I trusted them enough to allow them to handle the financial logistics of the venue and the premium catering for this event. That trust was entirely misplaced. I am formally releasing the evidence today that Vivian and her daughter-in-law Chloe conspired to embezzle $150,000 directly from my corporate business account. The lead reporter from Channel 5 pushed her microphone slightly forward, her eyes wide with journalistic intensity. Director Zariah, she asked, her voice loud and urgent. Can you detail exactly how they managed to execute this level of wire fraud without triggering your corporate security alarms immediately? It was an inside operation exploiting a position of personal trust. I answered, maintaining my steady gaze into the primary broadcast lens. They utilized forged vendor contracts. When I was presented with the final paperwork for the venue, the routing and account numbers had been deliberately altered. Instead of my funds transferring to the Grand Atrium corporate management account, the entire sum was illegally redirected into an offshore holding company. I paused for a fraction of a second, allowing the severe legal implications of those words to fully register with the press and the viewing public. That offshore holding company, I stated, my voice dropping to a serious lethal pitch, is directly controlled by Chloe as a slush fund to hide the catastrophic financial losses of her failing lifestyle brand. The audio recording you just heard, which was legally obtained through my firm internal security audits, confirms their exact intent. They stole my money to temporarily balance her corporate ledgers because she is currently facing a massive audit by the Internal Revenue Service for tax evasion. The impact of that statement on live television was absolutely devastating. It was one thing to be accused of a crime in a private parking lot dispute. It was an entirely different universe of destruction to have the exact mechanics of your federal tax evasion broadcast live on the evening news. The Steadicam operator quickly panned the lens away from me, swinging the camera to capture Chloe's reaction. She was no longer crying. She was sitting completely still on the concrete pavement, staring blankly at the front tire of her white sports car. Her vanity, her arrogance, her white privilege, all of it had been completely vaporized by the sheer, undeniable force of public exposure. She looked like a hollow, empty shell of a human being. A reporter from the Premier State Network shouted a follow-up question over the noise of the crowd. Director, given the involvement of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, what is the immediate legal status of Chloe business operations? Are they still functioning as of this broadcast? I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with the reporter who asked the question. As of 1 hour ago, I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I have instructed my legal counsel to file multiple emergency injunctions. We are pursuing aggressive civil litigation against both Vivian and Chloe for fraud, embezzlement, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Furthermore, my legal team has formally petitioned a federal judge to immediately freeze all assets associated with Chloe Lifestyle brand and Vivian Real Estate Holdings to prevent any further concealment of the stolen funds. The mention of Vivian Real Estate Holdings sent another shockwave through the remaining wealthy relatives who had not already fled the scene. They knew that Vivian's husband, Marcus' father, built his entire identity on the success of his commercial real estate empire. Now that entire empire was being publicly dragged into a federal embezzlement scandal because of his wife's incredible arrogance. Vivian, who had been leaning against her luxury vehicle, suddenly let out a loud, desperate wail. She pushed herself off the side of the car, stumbling toward the cameras, her hands outstretched, pleading with the journalists. "Please, you have to stop broadcasting this," Vivian cried out, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. "This is a private family matter. She is lying. She is just a bitter, jealous girl trying to ruin us because she is not good enough for my son. You cannot put this on television. We are important people." The journalists ignored her completely. They did not even turn their microphones in her direction. She was no longer a wealthy socialite to be respected. She was just the frantic, desperate subject of a massive criminal exposé. I looked at Vivian and felt a deep, profound sense of closure. She had spent the entire morning trying to make me feel small. She had called me a girl from the slums. She had locked the doors of the venue, hoping to publicly humiliate my family and send me running away in tears. But the woman standing in front of the cameras was not the weak, accommodating girl she thought she could bully. I was a corporate executive who destroyed corrupt empires before lunch. I turned back to the primary broadcast lens, delivering my final statement to the public. To the viewing audience, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I said, my voice strong and resolute. Financial abuse and corporate fraud thrive in the shadows. They rely on the silence and the fear of the victims. I am stepping forward today because I refuse to be silenced by anyone regardless of their supposed social standing or their wealth. The evidence has been submitted, the authorities have been notified, and I will ensure that every single individual involved in this criminal conspiracy faces the absolute maximum penalty under federal law. I gave the cameras a single sharp professional nod, signaling the absolute end of my statement. I stepped back smoothly from the cluster of microphones, the bright white spotlight still illuminating my custom silk gown. The press pool erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions begging for further comment, but my part in the media spectacle was officially over. I had lit the match, I had thrown it onto their gasoline-soaked legacy, and now I was simply going to step back and watch the entire toxic empire burn to the ground. The media frenzy continued to escalate, but my attention shifted entirely back to the women standing near the luxury vehicles. The camera lens of the moment performed a hard, sharp zoom directly onto Chloe's pale, distorted face. She was completely cornered, and she knew it. The federal investigation was no longer a secret rumor. Her total financial ruin was actively playing out on live television across the entire state of Georgia. She looked wildly around the parking lot, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths, searching for any possible escape route. But the reporters had effectively boxed them in, forming a solid wall of cameras and microphones. With the undeniable facts completely stacked against her and her guilt fully exposed, Chloe resorted to the oldest, most destructive defense mechanism available to her. She decided to weaponize her tears. Chloe pushed herself away from the side of her pristine white sports car. She threw her hands up into the air, her face twisting into a horrific mask of pure manufactured agony. She let out a piercing theatrical scream that cut right through the chaotic noise of the press pool, forcing several journalists to lower their microphones in sheer surprise. "You are all attacking me!" she shrieked, her voice trembling with perfect calculated terror. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "She is just bullying me because I am the only white person here." The audacity of her statement hung in the warm evening air like a toxic cloud. Chloe stumbled forward, wrapping her arms around her own torso, acting as though she were in immediate physical danger. "Look at how she is treating me!" Chloe wailed loudly, making sure she was positioned perfectly in front of the primary broadcast cameras. "She hates me because I am a successful white woman, and she is trying to destroy my entire life because she is jealous of my family. She orchestrated this entire media circus just to humiliate the only white woman in the wedding party. I am the real victim here." It was a deeply dangerous and historically violent narrative to invoke. She was standing in a parking lot surrounded by a prominent black family, trying to paint herself as a fragile, innocent white victim being aggressively targeted by an angry, jealous black woman. In any other setting, without the cameras rolling, and the undeniable proof already established, her white tears might have actually worked. Society has been conditioned for centuries to protect that exact performance. Julian immediately jumped onto her fabricated narrative, seeing a desperate final opportunity to salvage his wife's reputation. He stepped in front of Chloe, puffing out his chest and glaring at the media pool. "You all need to back off right now," Julian bellowed, waving his arms aggressively at the reporters. You are enabling a racially motivated attack against my wife. Zariah is completely unhinged, and she is using the media to carry out a racist vendetta. Turn the cameras off and leave my innocent wife alone. The reporters hesitated for a fraction of a second. The sudden injection of race into the conflict created a momentary ripple of uncertainty among the press pool. A few of the camera operators shifted their lenses, looking back and forth between my calm, stoic posture and Chloe's dramatic, sobbing form. Chloe buried her face in her hands, letting her shoulders shake violently, giving the cameras the perfect tragic visual of a broken, victimized woman. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against her incredibly toxic and blatantly racist accusations. I did not try to argue with her or explain to the media that my actions had absolutely nothing to do with the color of her skin. Arguing with white tears only validates the delusion that there is a genuine conflict taking place. I knew that the only way to completely obliterate a masterclass in manipulation was to introduce cold, hard, indisputable visual reality. I simply raised my right hand into the air and snapped my fingers. The sound was sharp and commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade. Immediately, my private corporate security team sprang into action. I had hired them weeks ago to manage the VIP entrances for the wedding, but I had repurposed them earlier this afternoon when I realized what Vivian and Chloe had done. 6 massive men dressed in immaculate black suits stepped out from the shadows of the VIP drop-off lane. They moved with silent military precision, completely ignoring the chaotic shouting of Julian and the loud theatrical sobbing of Chloe. 2 of the security officers wheeled out a heavy-duty industrial media cart. Resting on top of the cart was a massive commercial-grade outdoor projector, the exact kind used to display high-definition visuals on the sides of skyscrapers during major corporate events. A third officer rapidly uncoiled a thick power cable, plugging it directly into a portable heavy-duty generator they had stationed near the venue entrance. "What are you doing?" Vivian demanded, her voice trembling as she watched the men set up the massive piece of equipment. "Stop them, Marcus. Make them stop." Marcus did absolutely nothing. He was leaning against a parked car, looking entirely defeated, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the situation. He was finally watching the true power dynamic of the real world unfold, and he realized he had absolutely no authority in my domain. The lead security officer tapped a few commands into a wireless tablet connected to the projector. The heavy cooling fans inside the massive machine whirred to life, sounding like a small jet engine spinning up. A blindingly bright beam of pure white light shot out from the heavy glass lens of the projector, cutting through the dimming evening light of the parking lot. The massive beam hit the side of the grand atrium building perfectly. The venue featured a sprawling 3-story windowless wall of smooth white concrete, designed to display elegant floral lighting during evening receptions. Now it was serving as the largest, most undeniable billboard of criminal evidence in the history of Atlanta high society. The image that materialized on the wall was absolutely staggering. It was 40 feet tall and 30 feet wide, illuminated in crisp, high-definition resolution for every single person in the parking lot to read. It was the official wire transfer receipt from my corporate bank account. The media pool let out a collective gasp. The camera operators scrambled rapidly, abandoning their tight focus on Chloe's weeping face and frantically pivoting their heavy broadcast lenses upward to capture the massive document glowing against the side of the building. Every single detail of their federal crime was magnified to the size of a commercial semi-truck. At the very top of the document, my original authorization for $150,000 was clearly visible, but the truly damning evidence was located in the center of the projection. The routing numbers and the receiving account details had been circled in bright red digital ink by my investigative team. Right next to the fraudulent account numbers was the official registered name of the receiving entity. It was not the Grand Atrium Property Management Company. It was the exact legal name of Chloe Failing Lifestyle brand. And right at the bottom of the forged vendor contract displayed on the massive concrete wall was a signature. It was not my signature. It was a hasty, sloppy forgery that had been countersigned by the primary account holder of the receiving slush fund. The name Chloe Kensington was written in massive, sprawling, cursive letters, practically glowing in the dark. Look closely at the wall, I instructed the media, my voice echoing with absolute authority. That is not an angry black woman bullying an innocent white victim. That is a 40-foot-tall federal felony. That is the exact routing number of her offshore holding account, and that is her legal signature authorizing the theft of my wedding funds. Chloe victim narrative died instantly. The white tears that she had desperately hoped would save her completely evaporated in the blinding light of the massive projector. She slowly lowered her hands from her face, turning her head to look at the side of the building. Her mouth dropped open in silent horror as she stared at her own signature, projected across 3 stories of solid concrete. There was nowhere left to hide. There was no social construct, no racial stereotype, and no amount of fake crying that could possibly erase the massive glowing evidence of her guilt. Julian took 3 slow steps backward, physically distancing himself from his wife. He stared at the massive wire transfer receipt, his face pale and completely devoid of his previous arrogant rage. He could not argue with a 40-foot-tall bank document. He finally realized that his wife was not a victim. She was a master manipulator and a federal criminal who had just destroyed their entire lives. The reporters did not even bother asking Chloe for a comment anymore. Her white tears had been rendered entirely, completely useless. The journalists were speaking rapidly into their microphones, narrating the incredible visual evidence displayed on the side of the building. They were no longer covering a family dispute. They were broadcasting an open and shut criminal case live to millions of viewers. I stood in the center of the parking lot, watching the glowing light of the projector reflect off the locked glass doors of the venue, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute total victory. The camera pulled back smoothly, widening the frame to capture the absolute stark contrast of the entire scene. On the left side of the parking lot stood the remnants of Marcus' family. They were huddled together in the dimming evening shadows, looking like a defeated army that had just realized they were fighting on the wrong side of history. The wealthy socialites who had arrived in their luxury sedans expecting a glamorous evening were now completely silent, their expensive clothes looking entirely out of place in the middle of a federal crime scene. On the right side, bathed in the brilliant white light of the television spotlights, I stood completely alone. But I did not look isolated. I looked like an immovable force of nature. The physical distance between us was only about 30 feet of concrete, but the psychological gulf was absolutely immeasurable. I had completely stripped away their unearned superiority, exposing the hollow, corrupt foundation of their entire existence. The massive projection on the wall of the grand atrium continued to glow brightly, casting a harsh blue and white hue across the pavement. The reporters were still speaking rapidly to their camera operators, detailing the irrefutable evidence of the wire fraud. Chloe was still sitting on the ground, weeping into her hands, completely abandoned by her husband Julian. But Vivian could not accept defeat. Her mind was so deeply poisoned by decades of wealth and privilege that she simply could not process the fact that she had lost. She could not accept that a woman from South Atlanta had outsmarted her, outmaneuvered her, and publicly destroyed her. Vivian suddenly pushed herself away from the side of her luxury vehicle, her eyes wide and wild with a completely new level of desperation. She reached into her designer handbag, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it on the concrete. She pulled out her cell phone, gripping it like it was a loaded weapon. If she could not win the moral argument, and if she could not win the legal argument, she was going to rely on the only thing she had left: her elite social connections. "Turn that projector off right now!" Vivian shrieked, her voice completely raw and cracking under the immense strain. She pointed her phone directly at my security team, who were standing silently beside the heavy equipment. "You are vandalizing private property. You are projecting your filthy lies onto a building that does not belong to you." I did not signal my security team to turn the machine off. The massive 40-foot-tall bank receipt remained perfectly illuminated on the concrete wall for every single camera to capture. "Do you hear me?" Vivian screamed, taking several aggressive steps toward me, her designer heels scraping harshly against the pavement. "This venue belongs to my closest friend, Victoria. We play tennis at the country club every single Tuesday. She gave us exclusive access to this property because she knows our family represents the absolute highest tier of society in this city. When I tell her what you are doing to her building, she is going to absolutely ruin you." The reporters paused their narrations, turning their microphones toward Vivian. She saw the media attention shifting back to her, and she immediately tried to seize the narrative once again. She puffed out her chest, attempting to project authority, but she just looked completely unhinged. "I am calling the police right this second," Vivian yelled, holding her phone high in the air for the cameras to see. "I am calling the chief of police directly. He is a personal friend of my husband. I am going to have you arrested, Zariah. I am going to have you thrown in the back of a squad car for trespassing on private property, for illegal surveillance, and for corporate vandalism. You are not going to leave this parking lot in a wedding dress. You are going to leave in handcuffs." I maintained my perfect, absolute silence. I did not need to raise my voice to match her frantic screaming. I did not need to explain the intricate details of commercial real estate law to a woman who was actively having a psychological breakdown on live television. I simply watched her punch numbers into her cell phone, her manicured fingers slipping and sliding across the glass screen because they were shaking so badly. Marcus stepped forward, finally finding a tiny shred of his voice. "Mom, just stop," he pleaded, his voice weak and completely devoid of any real conviction. "Please, just put the phone away. The cameras are still recording. You are making it worse." "Do not tell me to stop," Vivian snapped viciously, turning her rage onto her own son. "She is destroying our family. She is trying to send Chloe to federal prison. We are not going to let some little public relations girl from the slums dictate our future. I am having her arrested. Victoria will want her arrested for defacing the Grand Atrium." She pressed the phone to her ear, pacing back and forth in front of the locked glass doors of the venue. The thick, heavy steel chains wrapped around the golden handles caught the light of the television cameras, serving as a constant visual reminder of her incredible cruelty. She had ordered those chains to be locked. She had planned to leave me standing on the outside, looking in, completely humiliated. Now she was desperately trying to use the ownership of the building as her final weapon to put me behind bars. "Hello," Vivian barked into the phone, her voice echoing loudly across the silent crowd. "Yes, connect me to the chief of police immediately. This is Vivian." "Yes, he knows exactly who I am. Tell him I have a violent trespasser vandalizing the Grand Atrium Banquet Hall, and I need officers dispatched immediately." The reporters watched her with a mixture of professional curiosity and absolute pity. They knew as well as I did that the police could not save her from a federal wire fraud investigation. But Vivian was completely lost in her own delusion. She lowered the phone from her ear, a triumphant, twisted smile spreading across her pale, sweaty face. She looked directly at me, her eyes burning with pure hatred. "They are on their way," Vivian announced, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "The police are coming, Zariah. You thought you were so incredibly smart. You thought you could just bring the media here and embarrass us. But you forgot that we own this city. We own the people in power. And you do not have permission to be on this property. You are going to jail." I let a slow, calm smile spread across my face. I looked at the heavy steel chains wrapped tightly around the front doors of the Grand Atrium. The chains Vivian had proudly claimed she ordered. The chains that were supposed to symbolize my complete exclusion from their wealthy elite world. Before I could even open my mouth to respond to her pathetic final threat, a loud metallic crashing sound echoed from the front of the building. Vivian froze. Marcus spun around. The camera operators immediately whipped their lenses toward the main entrance. The heavy steel chains wrapped around the golden door handles suddenly pulled taut, rattling violently against the thick glass. The sound was deafening in the quiet parking lot, like a massive iron cage being rattled by something incredibly powerful on the inside. Vivian took a step backward, her triumphant smile instantly vanishing. She had personally locked those doors from the outside. The building was supposed to be completely, entirely empty. Another loud metallic crash echoed through the evening air, followed immediately by the sharp snapping sound of the heavy industrial padlock breaking open. The thick steel chains fell to the concrete floor with a heavy, solid thud. And then the massive glass doors of the Grand Atrium burst wide open from the inside. The camera performed a smooth, steady dolly in moving directly past Vivian, frozen form, and focusing entirely on the dark, gaping entrance of the banquet hall. Out of the shadows of the massive foyer stepped a man who commanded absolute immediate respect. He was a tall, powerfully built black man, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray pinstripe suit. His presence alone was enough to silence the remaining murmurs in the parking lot. He stepped over the broken steel chains, as if they were nothing more than discarded garbage on the pavement. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had just closed the most lucrative deal of his entire fiscal year. Vivian stared at him, her phone slipping completely out of her trembling hand and shattering against the concrete. She recognized him immediately. Everyone in the Atlanta commercial real estate sphere recognized him. He was the chief executive officer of the premier property holding group that owned dozens of luxury venues across the state, including the Grand Atrium. He was the man her supposed best friend Victoria reported to. He was the ultimate authority over the building she had just confidently claimed to control. Vivian opened her mouth, trying to form a coherent sentence, trying to leverage her non-existent social connections to demand an explanation. But the chief executive officer did not even glance in her direction. He walked with long, deliberate strides straight through the flashing lights of the television cameras, heading directly toward me. The media pool parted instantly, allowing him to step right up to where I stood. The cameras captured the exact moment he extended his hand toward me, a warm, professional smile breaking across his stern, authoritative face. "Congratulations, Director," he announced, his deep, rich voice carrying perfectly across the silent parking lot and straight into the broadcasting microphones. "The corporate acquisition is completely finalized. All the legal paperwork cleared the state registry precisely on schedule. As of 8 a.m. this morning, the entire Grand Atrium property, including the surrounding estate, is officially owned by you, Zariah." The magnitude of his statement hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. The reporters actually gasped, lowering their microphones for a split second as their brains struggled to process the sheer scale of the power play they were witnessing. I had not just rented a venue for my wedding. I had weaponized my massive corporate capital to completely purchase the multi-million-dollar property right out from under them. I had bought the entire building just to guarantee that the woman who tried to lock me out would never be able to step foot inside it again. I reached out and shook his hand firmly, my own smile reflecting the absolute finality of my victory. "Thank you for expediting the commercial transfer," I replied, my voice projecting absolute, unshakable authority. "Your team executed the transition flawlessly. I look forward to our continued partnerships in the future." Vivian let out a sound that was less of a word and more of a dying gasp. Her knees finally buckled under the crushing weight of reality. She sank down onto the hard asphalt, her expensive emerald green gown pooling around her like a deflated balloon. She had just tried to have me arrested for trespassing on a property that I legally owned. She had tried to humiliate me by locking me out of a building that belonged entirely to my corporate portfolio. Every single cruel, arrogant weapon she had tried to use against me had just exploded directly in her face on live television. Marcus was leaning against a concrete pillar, clutching his chest, looking as though he were having a physical heart attack. He finally understood the full, terrifying scope of the woman he had tried to force onto her knees. I was not just a successful public relations executive. I was a commercial real estate titan who could buy and sell his entire family legacy before breakfast. I had played their arrogant game, and I had completely obliterated them on the grandest stage possible. The camera angle tightened, pushing past the reporters and focusing entirely on a sharp close-up of my face. The cold, triumphant smile that spread across my features was the culmination of an entire day of absolute perfect vindication. I did not need to shout. I did not need to hurl insults the way Vivian and Chloe had. The sheer crushing weight of the evidence I had just presented was doing all the heavy lifting for me. The sound of heavy tires approaching from the main street drew the attention of the media pool. But it was not more news vans. Two black, unmarked government vehicles pulled smoothly into the parking lot, stopping directly behind the broadcast trucks. The doors opened in perfect synchronization, and 4 agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across the back stepped out onto the pavement. The collective silence of the wealthy relatives was completely shattered. Julian stumbled backward, his face pale with shock watching the federal agents approach his wife. Chloe let out a terrifyingly sharp scream, scrambling backward on her hands and knees, across the concrete, desperately trying to put distance between herself and the approaching officers. Chloe Kensington, one of the agents, announced, his voice cutting through the remaining noise with absolute authority. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest regarding multiple counts of wire fraud and tax evasion." 2 agents stepped forward, pulling a hysterical, screaming Chloe to her feet and securing heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. The television cameras captured every single agonizing second of her arrest, the bright spotlights illuminating the final, devastating collapse of her wealthy white privilege. Vivian watched the scene unfold from the ground, completely broken, unable to even formulate a single word in defense of her daughter-in-law. I looked at the remaining members of Marcus' family, the arrogant socialites who had laughed at me and called me a girl from the slums. They were frozen in terror, watching the ultimate consequence of their toxic vanity play out in real time. I lifted my chin, ensuring my voice carried perfectly through the dozen microphones still pointed directly at me. The final command was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. Now I said, my voice echoing across the locked glass doors of the building I now owned. "Get off my property!" The chaotic flashing lights of the news vans and the frantic screaming of my former in-laws slowly faded away. The memory dissolves entirely, and we are right back here in the quiet luxury of my penthouse living room. I lean forward, resting my arms on my knees, and look directly into the camera lens, meeting your eyes. The absolute madness of that afternoon feels like a lifetime ago, but the lesson remains permanently etched into my mind. You probably think that was the absolute end of the night. You probably assume I went home, ordered takeout, and cried myself to sleep over a canceled wedding and a broken engagement. But you have to remember that I am a crisis manager, and I never let a perfectly good multi-million-dollar venue go to waste. I did not cancel the reception. I simply permanently purged the guest list. Once the federal agents hauled Chloe away in the back of an unmarked vehicle, and Marcus finally dragged his hysterical mother off my concrete pavement, I walked right through the open doors of the grand atrium. I found the bridal suite, and I took off that heavy, restrictive silk wedding gown. I completely shed the crushing expectations of a family that only ever saw me as a target to be exploited. I left that dress on the floor. In its place, I put on a sharp, custom-tailored, stark white designer power suit. I opened the doors of the banquet hall exclusively to the people who truly deserved to be there. My hard-working parents, who had sacrificed absolutely everything for my success, walked in with their heads held high. My aunts, uncles, and cousins, who stood bravely by my side when the wealthy mob closed in, filled the room with genuine laughter. My powerful corporate clients joined us, raising their glasses in respect. We drank top-shelf champagne, we ate the premium catering I had already paid for, and we celebrated the absolute greatest corporate acquisition of my entire professional career. I am telling you this story because I know exactly how many of you are out there right now making yourselves smaller just to make other people comfortable. I am talking directly to the Black women who are constantly told they are too loud, too ambitious, or too aggressive by people who are secretly intimidated by their brilliance. Never shrink yourself to fit into a family, a boardroom, or a relationship that does not know your absolute worth. When they try to build a wall to keep you out, do not stand in the parking lot begging for a key. Buy the entire building and evict them. If this story resonated with you today, and if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who they are dealing with, hit that like button right now. Share this video with a woman in your life who needs a powerful reminder of her own incredible worth today. Drop a comment below and tell me about the exact moment you finally stopped accepting less than you deserve. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel because, trust me, you will not want to miss the next time I have to teach a masterclass in corporate karma. Stay powerful, and I will see you in the next video. What part of the story resonated with you the most?